Hello, my name's Mr. McQuire and I want to welcome you today to this presentation where we will be looking at types and parts of cells. So before we get going, let's first of all ensure we have somewhere as quiet as possible to work, free from distractions, and you will need some paper, a few sheets of paper and a pen. So if you need to stop the presentation to collect those, please pause it now. So in this lesson, the outcomes will be, first of all, the challenge to be able to identify different parts of the cell and to be able to recall what each part of the cell does. That's going to be essential, and we won't be able to move on to the Aspire until we've got that bit nailed properly. For the Aspire to be able to compare the different structures found in, and these are new words to you possibly, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So we're going to generate quite a lot of information today with diagrams and work that we will need to revisit and look at in our notes. So we need some quality notes from today's lesson. So starting from work that you should have done at primary school, we have in front of you something that you are being asked about. So what is that? And then we have some labels that are part of the Key Stage 2 curriculum, and I'd like you to just have a look at that diagram for a second, see if you know what the diagram is first, see if you know any of those labels. I'll just give you 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, so let's talk about and hopefully about what you've thought about. First of all, the picture in front of you is of a cell. Can you label any particular parts of that cell? So let's just have a look at the labels. First of all, the top part, which is just pointing at nowhere in there, although there's a dot on the end of it, it says cytoplasm, and underneath that is a nucleus. And we have a cell membrane, and in the center of those we have something called a mitochondrion. Okay, now we're going to revisit those and revise those during the course of the lesson, but they're words that we should know from Key Stage 2 work that you've done. Down at the bottom of the page, I just want to touch on the keywords for today. So if you need to know where you're looking, and we could tick these off as we go. We have a cell, a eukaryotic type and a prokaryotic type, and then we have some organelles within the cell, which includes the nucleus, cytoplasm, cell membrane, cell wall, mitochondria, something called a ribosome, a chloroplast, and a thing called a vacuole. So we're going to hopefully become very familiar with those terms so that in the future, when you come across a picture like this, it will mean much more to you. So that's an exciting journey. Let's enjoy doing that together today. So here we are. Look at these pictures that we've got. I'm not going to go through them with you. I'd like you to try and think up possible answers to the question that's in front of you. What do all of these pictures have in common? Okay, I'm going to put some music on for 30 seconds, and I want you to try and think of as many answers as possible to what all of those things in front of them have in common. 30 seconds, away you go. Okay, well, there are plenty of correct answers, and there are also, I suspect, plenty of wrong answers. But maybe you've come up with the following while you've been looking at. So let's have a discussion about what you have been thinking about. First of all living things must do all 7 of these life processes, and if you look at the first letter of those, you'll see that you can make Mrs. Gren out of those. So all living things, you may have said on that picture, could move or respire or sense, grow, reproduce, excrete, and some form of nutrition. You may have talked about the fact that all of them are made of either single, unicellular, like a bacteria, or are made of many cells, which is called multicellular. And as you can see, there's a big number there. In us, we estimate that we're made of 37.2 trillion cells. That's an awful lot of cells. So, on your piece of paper, could you please, in the middle at the top, put a title of a plant cell? And we're going to start on the challenge part of our learning outcomes to identify the different parts of the cell. I'd like you to then label the parts of the cell as we have there. Can I just make it clear that the cytoplasm at the top of the label list there is just a dot that's on the end of the line. It's actually just pointing into the space. The nucleus, the blue blob, is there. Okay, we've got the cell membrane, which is pointing to the inside of the wall, whereas the cellulose cell wall is pointing to the outer part of the cell. Mitochondria, and there's a little kind of lozenge, kind of strepsil shaped thing. And then we've got this big thing called a permanent vacuole, and then the green thing called a chloroplast. Now, this particular plant cell here is something that we could have taken out of a leaf, and in later lessons we'll be looking at things called specialized cells, and this particular cell is one of those. It's actually called a palisade cell. So I'm now going to give you about 3 minutes, I think, to get this particular picture down. Now, with the labels in your notes, please be careful with the way that you do your spellings. We're going to look at the individual parts and their roles later in the lesson, so we need the spellings to be correct and the diagram to have a basic shape that's something similar to that. If you have a pencil, that would be excellent, just to help you diagram. There's no need to colour it in. So in a minute and a half, I'm going to start the timer, and then I would like you to have finished the diagram by the time we get to 3 minutes. So hopefully you now have a completed plant cell diagram in your notes. If you don't, then just pause the presentation now. If you completed that diagram, then can I ask you to put your hand over the labels that are on your diagram so that you can't see the labels anymore, but you can still see the plant cell. Now the challenge is to be able to identify the different parts of the cell. And I'd like you to pause the presentation at this point for as long as you need to be able to run down those labels that are under your hand to be able to label them properly. This may take quite a long time, and I don't want to limit you in terms of giving you a timer to allow that to happen. So let me just repeat that. To be able to identify the different parts of the cell, we have to practice that particular feature of this lesson. So if you put your hand now over the labels, cytoplasm, nucleus, etc., you will still be able to see the arrows pointing to them. I'd like you to practice getting those labels right until you can label those parts of the cell without looking at the parts. Okay, so we're now going to do the same, but this time with an animal cell. If you look around the labels that are on that cell, you can see some that are familiar to you already, which is interesting because we're going to share some features between those cells. So to do a nice diagram, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to be able to draw that cell properly. So in about 30 seconds I'll start the timer and possibly play you some exciting music for the last 30 seconds. So you've now got a couple of minutes to put a title of an animal cell under your plant cell and to sketch that cell quickly and put the labels that are there. Off you go. Okay, so your notes now should have a lovely picture of a plant cell with some labels around them. and a stunning picture of an animal cell with some labels around them. If you look at those two pictures, you should see names that are familiar to both of them, but you should also see that there are some labels that are on one and not on another. And that's the kind of difference that people like to test when you're doing questions on cells. So it's important that we know the differences between plants and animal cells, and also as we have in the challenge outcome for the lesson, to be able to recall what each part of the cell does. So a bit of practice going around the labels for the animal cell might not go amiss at this point. If you need to practice those, then put your hand over them and just see if you can do that. Pause the presentation. Okay, we're going to ask some questions now. So you may need to start a new page if you've filled one page with your two diagrams that you've drawn. We're going to go through it and just look at these four questions that are here. Number one, what does the cell membrane do? Number two, what is found in the nucleus? And number three, what happens in the mitochondria? It's a strange name, isn't it? And number four, give three differences between plants and animal cells. Don't say I didn't warn you about question number four. So we are going to look at these four questions, and I'm going to help you a lot with this information because there are no sources that we can go to other than this presentation. So let's look at each of these questions. So we're going to include this work here as part of your classwork. So what does the cell membrane do? The cell membrane allows things to go in and out of the cell, and in my mind I have this kind of picture which I can reproduce with my fingers in a classroom. So I stick my thumbs out and point my fingers like a gun, and I do that with one hand with the thumb up and the other hand with the thumb down. Maybe you could do that in front of you now, see if you can mirror that. A cell membrane allows things to go in and out of the cell. Okay, just practice that. A cell membrane allows things to go in and out of the cell, and you can do that shape with your hands while you're saying it. That'll help you remember it. What is found in the nucleus? Well, the nucleus contains DNA, which is genetic information, and the function of that is to control. So the function of the nucleus is to control, and it does that by using DNA or genetic information. Third question, what happens in the mitochondria? And the answer to that you need to recall is aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration happens in the mitochondria if I reverse that particular question. Now, looking at your diagrams in front of you, you should be able to spot these three differences between the top plant diagram and the bottom simpler animal diagram. Give three differences between plant and animal cells. Plant cells have a cell wall that's made of cellulose. They have a permanent vacuole, and they all also have a chloroplast, which you will learn about in future lessons to do with photosynthesis in plants. Now, this will take a few minutes to put down. I don't need the title of correct answers to record. We just need some notes about what's happening in those lovely cell diagrams that you've drawn. So what I'd like you to do, if you have two colours of pen, you can change the pen colour for each of these. But this will take you a good maybe 5, even 8 minutes, I think, to be able to put this down properly. So I'm going to give you 8 minutes, and I'll start the timer in the last 2 just to remind you. So you're going to need to put the information down that's in front of you, set it out exactly like I have so that it stands out, and you could put bullet points on each of those black lines that you've got there. 4 particular questions, 4 particular answers that we need to understand because we need to identify the roles of what each part of a cell does. So 8 minutes starting now. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a picture of a plant cell and animal cell, both of them labelled, and now we have got some straightforward notes which allows us to do some recall work about what parts of the cell do. Now, to revise that particular information, can I suggest that you put your hand across your page and cover up the second line down, and then you can read the top line, what does a cell membrane do? And the answer, of course, is to allow things to go in and out of the cell. And you can then do something strange with your hands, doing an impression of that double arrow thing on the right hand side. What's the nucleus do? It controls what's inside the nucleus. So really there's two answers to questions there. What happens in the mitochondria and aerobic respiration? And give three differences between plant and animal cells that have a cell wall, a vacuole and a chloroplast. So you could pause this presentation now, just put your hand across those and just practice those. You could take your book to somebody, your paper to somebody, and just get them to rehearse those with you along with the cell labels as well. Okay, looking back at our learning outcomes, first of all, our challenge to be able to identify different parts of the cell, and you should be able to do those now with more practice perhaps, and you should be able to recall what each part of the cell does. So big tick for the challenge. Now, to be able to compare the different structures found in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And now, obviously, those two words may be completely and utterly new to you, so we need to very carefully now just develop your knowledge. You need to know, first of all, that cells come in two types, and they are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So let's, first of all, just familiarize ourselves with what that means. If you could please put down in your book the title that is there, Types of Cells. And then underneath that, I'd like you to copy down the notes that are there. I've underlined the word eukaryotic cells, and I've underlined the prokaryotic cells, and it just gives you some basic information that I can then use in the next few minutes to help teach you about the differences between these particular cells. So just a couple of minutes to do that. Off you go. So if you need more time, just pause the presentation now and then restart when you've finished those notes that are there. Let's use your notes for a second, however, and just check that you have understood what you have written down. Animals and plant cells belong to a particular group of cells called eukaryotic cells. There are another group of cells not found in animals and plant cells that are called prokaryotic cells. So far in this presentation, I have asked you to draw a picture of an animal plant cell. Can you now please go back to those two pictures and can you label them with the correct label, which could either be eukaryotic cell or prokaryotic cell? Using the information I've just given you, there's only one label from those two that's correct. Can you please write what you think is next to those now? I'll just give you 20 seconds to do that. Okay, you should have labelled those two cells because they are plant and animal cells as eukaryotic. So if you've made a mistake and put prokaryotic cells, please relabel them now. Okay, now let's add some information on our journey to that aspire to be able to compare the structures found in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Exciting. Okay. Here is a photograph of both of those types of cell. You should know the one on the left already. Look, it's a plant cell and you've already done a version of that in your notes. It is a eukaryotic cell. We could spend the next few moments putting labels on, but that's not where we're heading now. The prokaryotic cell, on the other hand, looks very strange. Okay. And I just want to be clear about some of the differences before we go any further. First of all, it has this strange structure on the bottom here, which is basically a tail. We call it a flagella. And inside it, the nucleus, well, where is it? We have DNA inside the nucleus, but that DNA is floating around and it's not contained within a nucleus. Now, I'm going to just try and give you some kind of a handle to help you at this point. In my head, the word pro, as in professional, is somebody that always comes first. And it's thought, although we're not particularly clear about this, that prokaryotic cells evolved on this planet first. The nucleus is a later evolution that we have on the eukaryotic cell. And we're now going to spend some time looking at the principal differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. But I wanted you to see obvious differences that are in front of you now. We're going to make this really, really simple, however. Okay, here's a better set of pictures. So there are some words here that I don't need you to understand at this stage, but I do want you to acknowledge the difference between those particular two types of cell. The left cell we're all happy with, a eukaryotic cell. It's very familiar to us, but the right hand side has some labels that we're still not particularly happy with, but you'll notice, just to say it again, there is no nucleus. Okay, and the DNA, which is here, is just floating around in the center of the cell, and then it has this weird structure on the end called a flagellum. Now we're going to just simplify this even more, and I have just taken some principal information that I really want you to understand to allow us to be able to complete a question on the Aspire if we had one. So we're looking here at two circles. This circle here is about prokaryotic cells. This circle here is about eukaryotic cells. But where the two circles overlap, that's things that they both share. So let me talk you through that. First of all, both of these organisms share DNA. Now, there are other things that they share, but I am really anxious to give you just principal answers that you can just pull out when you're learning this. So both of them contain DNA. However, the prokaryotic cell has no nucleus and the DNA is loose. If the question was, give me an example of a prokaryotic cell, then the example I would ask you to put down is a bacteria. On the other side, a eukaryotic cell, like a plant cell or an animal cell, contains a nucleus and the DNA is inside that nucleus. And if the question was, give me an example of a eukaryotic cell, the answer, which would be worth a mark, would be animal, plant cells or fungi. So that diagram I have produced for you as part of these notes just to help us to move along quickly so that we can answer the question, be able to compare and contrast the structures. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I'd like you to draw this particular diagram with the title at the top because it's in the right position, prokaryotic on the left, eukaryotic on the right, and the verses, the bit that's shared, is down the middle of the diagram. So if you've got a glass or something you can draw around, then you could neaten that diagram up. Otherwise, your circles are going to be freehand, so do your best with that. So 2 minutes. Now in my mind you've now got a beautiful set of notes in front of you with diagrams of plants and animal cells, and then you've got an explanation of what the different parts of the cells do, and then we've got some notes about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and then this lovely Venn diagram here which allows us to answer the question, what is found in one and not found in another. Now I've simplified this information down, and there are other things that are just prokaryotic and eukaryotic and shared between them, but this is the one that I would like you to remember today. Okay, focus on the nucleus. If you look at a diagram and it has a nucleus, then it's eukaryotic. If you look at a diagram and the DNA is floating around, it's prokaryotic. Questions generally that go with this topic would have a photograph of some description, and you would have to say what kind of cell it was, and that's the principal indicator that I'd like you to remember today. So today we have, for the challenge, looked at identifying different parts of cells. So we can identify plant and animal cells, and we should be able to recall what the part of the cells do. We've also then compared structures that are found in prokaryotic, eukaryotic cells, and I have told you about the principal things that I want you to remember to allow you to identify those structures. It's been a pleasure sharing this information with you today. Remember that you can pause this presentation, rewind sections of it to make sure that your notes are complete,